All right, can everyone see okay? Everyone can see the screen okay? All right, perfect. So as soon as we're done and we get all the teas delivered, we'll start because everyone is here. Does anyone have any questions before we start? All right, how many do you already have a favorite chocolate that's on this list? Like, I don't know if you've tried any before. But here's our list by country. I'm just going to sort of see where we're going to go. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the history of chocolate in the area, where it was 500 years ago, where it was 100 years ago, where it is today, in terms of economic impact, in terms of social impact, in terms of just what's available. And of course, we're going to try our 8 different chocolates. Now, all of these chocolates, does anyone have ingredient concerns? All of these are dark chocolates. There's no dairy in any of them. There's no nuts in any of them. But some may have traces of stuff in them, if that's a concern of anyone. Because we do have all the packages so you can read them if that's a concern. Generally, we stick with all dark chocolates because that's how you can really taste the nuances of the place where you're getting your chocolate from. Because if you think about chocolate flavor profile as a peak, right? You have a peak of flavor. Adding milk takes your peak and goes like this, right? It knocks all the sharp edges off, which is why, you can use bad quality chocolate that has peaks down here, right? And it can bring it, right? It knocks the edges off those peaks. So, any questions about anything while we're waiting for the last teas to get ready? 1 minute. We set timers. The only way to make it work is timers. So.
Are you going to show us the package of what we're trying as we go?
Yeah, I have all the packages here.
Oh,
right?
great.
Yes.
Yeah, they're all here.
Yes. Maybe.
In various forms. Well, they're all here.
Yes,
so.
Here we go.
We'll grab one of each and stick them here.
Okay.
Yeah, and so just.
Brook, are all these areas known for chocolate, or does any of them go? That's kind of weird that chocolate came from there.
No, they are not all known for chocolate. Most people don't think of Cuba and chocolate. All right. Most people don't think of Guanaja, of Honduras and chocolate, but we'll get to why it's that way anyway, because it's not actually from there. The Delrona is just named that. What?
Nothing.
We've got 8, right?
Yeah.
People may not realize that Trinidad is incredibly famous for chocolate, right? But people may not know that. Grenada may be more known for nutmeg, right? As the spice isle. Haiti, Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic is probably the most important location for cacao in the United States because proximity-wise, it's the closest, produces the highest quantity, has the best developed infrastructure, and it's what most bars out here will use if they're flavoring their chocolate with nuts or other sorts of things, because as soon as you start adding flavoring, the origin doesn't matter nearly as much for the nuances, and so you'll use Dominican cacao because it's often available organic, and it's often available at a much less expensive price because the main company that works out of the Dominican Republic has a warehouse in New York, so you don't have to import it. Which is where I get my cacao. We'll try one of ours, one of the ones we make here. And lots of people don't include Venezuela, but Venezuela is very famous for chocolate. It technically, I suppose, isn't necessarily considered part of the Caribbean, but we'll get to why that one's on there when we get there.
I'm just going to go right in between here and set them down.
Is this
That's Laura.
is this supposed to be Hawaii or is that?
Yes, that is Hawaii out over there.
And it has chocolate too?
Yeah, Hawaii is the only place in the United States you can grow chocolate.
What's my other tea?
Pear tea?
There.
And we're not trying any Hawaiian chocolate today, but Hawaiian chocolate is part of our world tours that we put together. So we put together boxed tours, sort of like what you have here, and it is a Hawaiian chocolate in there. Hawaii is very famous for chocolate. So.
Is the Yahara monk, the chocolate, is that one of your chocolates?
Yes, it is Yahara for me. And Monte Plata is the region of the Dominican Republic that it comes from. All right, so I think we all have our teas that we're looking for, and we're all set to go. So my name is Brook, if you didn't know that already, and this is my shop. We have about 250 different chocolate bars from all over the world, and I used to do these talks every month, pre-pandemic, and this is sort of we did a dry run a couple months ago, and we're gonna try and get to do these every month now, to do different things. And just to give a plug for our next one, we'll focus specifically on Grenada. So next month we're going to do one specifically just on the island of Grenada, because since the pandemic has ended, I've started to be able to travel again. So I traveled to the island of Grenada, and I have a whole bunch of fun chocolates to try from there that you can't get in the United States. That's the next one coming up. All right, so let's get started here. Let me get my remote here logged back in again. I can still log in here. All right, so you have the Caribbean, right? I think everything about chocolate should be about maps. I think everything about everything should be about maps, because those relations of where things are is so important. And many people, when they look at the Caribbean, are surprised about where things are, right? And how close, when you hear that Cuba's 90 miles away, you realize, well, yeah, it's really not that far away, right? So this is the area that we're going to talk about, is the Caribbean Sea. So drawing a map there is a travel itinerary. Can anyone guess whose travel itinerary that is? Any ideas?
Columbus?
Yeah, Columbus, on his fourth journey in 1502. And it was on his fourth journey in 1502 that he landed on the island of Guanaja. And that's going to be our first sample that you can try. And so everyone should have access to scissors. You should be able to split both ends and sort of peel it down. Or you can snip at the top and open each one. And we're going to try our first chocolate bar from Guanaja, called Guanaja. And the reason why this bar is called Guanaja, this is from Valrhona in France, 70% dark chocolate. This bar was released in 1986. In 1986, eating dark chocolate as a bar was not a thing. Like, people didn't do that. Valrhona was the first one who started to do that. And their marketing campaign was the most bitter chocolate you could try, but it was for eating. Right? And now a little bit about sampling is you have two pieces. You can actually bite these two pieces in half if you want to end up with 4 pieces.
I need you for a minute.
Sure. Okay.
And the sheet you gave. I put them in my order. That's my fault.
What?
Redo. So actually, you are number 4.
All right. So
It's gonna be a little game. Number 4. Oh, hi.
What? We're on number 4?
No, number 5, excuse me.
So a little bit of miscommunication. Bobby, who does all our packaging and does an amazing job with all our packaging.
Yeah, except this time right now.
Had a moment.
This is what I gave her. So she went in this order.
This is not the number
So
order.
I thought she was going in the number order up here.
That's my bad. Sorry, so we're on number 5.
So that's why. So let's get more scissors out.
Okay, right, okay. Well, you're just gonna have to share.
So
Who
let-
else needs? You got one at that
let me
table?
mark on here.
This table? Okay.
5.
I didn't even look at them. I just looked at the list. You have some there, right? Yeah. Okay, you're good, you have some scissors? Scissors back there?
So are we supposed to take number 5 then? That's
Yes.
And if you need extra samples, we can give you extra samples, so don't worry about that.
Yes.
All right, so to make it extra, so what we're trying, guanaja is your fifth one down.
Number 5.
Does anyone need it? Well, when we get to number 5, which we tried,
Okay. And you guys
Um,
have scissors
So
here?
it shouldn't be trying number 1.
no, which is grenada, we'll give you an extra sample when you get there if you already ate it.
I ate one of them.
Number
Number
5.
5.
Okay, number 5.
All right, does that make sense? So it just takes a little mental brain power. We thought we had it so you didn't have to make any decisions, but we will have to make a few decisions. All right? So zip open the fifth one here. So that will be your guanaja bar.
Oh,
That's better.
So that's
Number 1 on here,
That,
so this is what we're
number
trying.
5 on here, and which one is it?
We are going in order here. So guanaja, number 1. But it's the fifth one.
The 5th try, okay.
Good sample. All right? All right, so back to our story. If everyone has that clear. So back to our story. So Valrhona in 1986 introduced guanaja. They said everyone should try this bar. Everyone should love this bar. It has become the most popular pastry chocolate in the world. So if you've ever made any pastries from any sort of French cookbook, it will tell you the kind of Valrhona chocolate you should be using. Guanaja would be one of them. In 1987, the Valrhona felt no one was doing it well enough, so they opened their own pastry shop to show people how to really use it. Right? So this is a blend. This is a blend of chocolates from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Madagascar, and it's a consistent blend. I haven't tried the original, so I don't know, but I'd say it's a blend because they can maintain that consistency from year to year. And so this is when we talk about, are all these places famous? Guanaja is not famous for chocolate, but it's famous because it is the first place that Christopher Columbus encountered a chocolate bean. He didn't like it, right? They told him to make a drink out of it. He didn't like the drink. It wasn't until 1544 when Cortez came and was given it prepared for him that this became a thing, which of course he immediately added sugar to. And then it became a bigger thing, and it was a secret, really, for Spain for 100 years, how to make chocolate. All right, so did everyone get that fifth one out of there? They got guanaja? All right, so Christopher Columbus sailed in his last trip to the New World.
can I ask a question about guanaja? You said it's a blend. Does that mean they import beans from?
Yes, France does not make any chocolate.
Oh, so all of that is brought to France?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
So, yeah, so this is a French chocolate named for an island in the Caribbean.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry if I didn't make that clear enough. Yeah, so a blend. The reason why I call this a blend and specify that it's a blend is it's the only blend of any of the chocolates we're going to try. All the other chocolates are considered single origin chocolates, meaning not only do they come from a single country, most of them will come from a single plantation or a single estate within that country. So you can really get the nuances that way.
Okay.
Right? And so that's sort of what my drawing of a cacao pie would look like. And those are sort of the beans that he had in there that they traded for him, right? Some little beans that he really didn't know what to do with. And so it wasn't a big deal, right? It wasn't a big deal, like I said, until Cortez got it prepared for him and then brought that back to Spain. And this is what the island of Guanaja looks like, right? That's a nice spot.
We got our honeymoon.
Oh, you went there? Nice. Oh, well, so good timing. Right?
Do they make chocolate there on the island?
No, I don't think they even grow chocolate.
I need to see it there.
So as we'll find out, in where chocolate grows, it doesn't grow everywhere in the Caribbean. So I don't believe they even have chocolate there. All right. So then there's the rest of the journey. All right. So now we're going to go to Cuba, and Cuba is going to be your third one.
1, 2, 3.
Right? Now this is, and this gets to interesting region. You can see where the cacao is right here, where the place is right here. when you think of Cuba, oh, of course Cuba should be able to grow chocolate, right? It's right in the prime chocolate growing region. But it only grows on the farthest eastern side in the area of Baracoa, right? That's the only place they grow cacao there, because that's only where the mountains are. That's where the rainfall is right.
What is the prime chocolate growing region?
Right now, so the question is, what's the prime chocolate growing region? Right now, most cacao is made in Ghana and Ivory Coast. Is harvested in Ghana. So 60% of the world's cacao comes from Ghana and Ivory Coast. And so one of the differences that we'll get to is, here, before we go to that, so when you're trying your chocolate, I don't know, this one should be distinctly different from your first one you tried. This is a single origin one, just from that Baracoa area of Cuba. And there are a couple ways that you can be sampling your chocolate. You can let it sit on your tongue and just let it melt. You can press it up against the roof of your mouth and let it melt. You can chew it a little bit and then let it melt, right? And there are different ways that you can sample it. If you have something warm to drink, you can drink something a little bit warm to warm up your mouth and then try your chocolate, and that will cause your chocolate to melt more quickly. It'll give you different sensations, right? So what do people, I sort of skipped ahead on Guanaja. What were people's overall impressions of the first bar you tried, the first Guanaja bar, now that you have a second bar to compare it to, because that can matter as well. And the pictures you see on the screen can affect what you think about chocolates as well. So there's all sorts of things that aren't being controlled here. But you had Guanaja, which is dark, right? Probably pretty neutral, right? As flavor profiles. What do you think about the Cuban bar? What flavor profile would you give it?
Almost like pudding.
Pudding. Cigar?
Yeah.
So when you think of Cuba, what do you think of? You don't think of chocolate. You think of cigars. The first time rum, all right. The first time I tasted this chocolate is, how in the world could you have a chocolate that tasted so smoky?
Yeah.
But it is the only bar of every bar I have here that tastes like this. About 250 bars, it's the only one. And I stopped carrying it for a while because it got pretty pricey. I brought it back for this talk because it's such a distinctive bar. It's such an interesting bar. This bar pairs really, really well with dark wines. It pairs really, really well, actually, if you want to pair your chocolate with coffee, because it has a strong enough flavor to interact with other strong flavors, right? This is 75%. So the first one was 70%, the next one's 75%. When you see that percentage on a chocolate bar, sorry, I should hold it up. All right, here you are. When you see that percentage on a chocolate bar, that's the percent cocoa solids in the bar. And whatever isn't in there up to 100 is sugar. So this is 25% sugar. The same way that this one is 30% sugar. So that's really what that number means.
How do you get Cuban products into the U.S.? Do they have to go to France?
Well, because it comes from France.
France.
So a funny story about Cuban products is this bar got PayPal kicked off of my site because PayPal refused to process payments from my site because I was selling banned products. And instead of fighting PayPal and saying it's not a banned product, I just said fine, so I cut them out of my site.
Okay,
But yeah, that's because it's coming from France.
makes sense.
There's
But-
almost a spicy quality to it.
Yeah, and the more you try it, it may taste different. What you have, what you see, what you try beforehand may change the quality. It's very, very smooth.
Yeah.
And that comes from the conching process of making chocolate, where the chocolate is ground with granite rollers for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, right? And to get the particle size down small enough so that it tastes smooth. Most Francois Pralou bars, to me, border on being so smooth they're almost sticky. And some people really like that. I personally don't. This is the only bar of theirs I carry because of its flavor profile. Has changed in the last few times. They also have, if you look at the ingredients in this, it does have lecithin in it as an emulsifier. They used to use soy lecithin, now they use sunflower lecithin. There are very few bars that have that third ingredient of anything I carry. So there has to be a very specific reason for me to carry a bar with lecithin in it because it's not needed.
What
Except
does it do?
A very, very small amount of it makes your chocolate much more liquid, so it pumps through pipes easier. Is the only reason it's added, because it's for the industrial process of making chocolate. But when so many chocolates can do without it, I don't see the need, right? Except if you're a bigger, this is a relatively bigger company. Pralou is in France. This is another French bar. All right, so we were there in Baracoa, and now we're going to go over to Haiti. And Haiti is the fourth one down.
Fourth one,
Fourth one down.
okay.
Now this one's a little bit different, not just because it's from Haiti, but because it's honeymoon chocolate from St. Louis. This is made in St. Louis. It's only sweetened with honey, so there's no cane sugar in this chocolate. It's only sweetened with honey. And you'll notice, sometimes I put in the Escania bar for this one instead, which is made in Haiti, and I like to use Escania because it's made in country in Haiti. But it's also fun to try a different sugar, which makes the bar softer. The honey as a complex sugar really influences the flavor that you get from your chocolate. Now this one is up to 77%. So this is 23% honey. And because honey is really difficult to work with, the honey is added at the very end, right before they make the chocolate bars. Because you can't put honey in a grinder.
So is that the honey that makes it taste so different then?
Mainly. It's mainly the honey that you're getting as opposed to the Haitian chocolate that you're tasting in terms of it being different than the Cuban bar or different than the Guanaja bar. So like I said, this is made in St. Louis.
Do you know what the flavor of the honey is?
I haven't tried the honey specifically. This one is Missouri wildflower and clover honey, so I guess it's a fairly light honey. As those things go.
Very fruity.
And so this comes from a cooperative called PISA, and we'll talk about what a cooperative means in chocolate. And that is most of these countries are small landowners making the chocolate. They, at most, have 6-acre, 5-acre farms. A 5 or 6-acre farm can only produce a couple tons of cacao every year. So what if you want to have a marketable product? Well, a couple tons of cacao is not a marketable product to any manufacturer. So what, like the PISA cooperative is in Haiti, is they have, I think they have 60 farmers in this cooperative right now, is they pool their beans. They pool what's most important, they pool their fermentation process of fermenting the beans, and we'll get to pictures of that later on. So that's all done in a central area where it can be controlled by people who know a lot about the fermentation process of the beans. And then that as a bulk can be then marketed to other places in the world. So almost all of these places, there's, with a couple exceptions, almost all of these places their cacao comes from a cooperative type setting amongst a lot of farmers. To be able to provide enough chocolate to get there. So this is an example of the region of Haiti that it comes from. And this gets us to the next question, this is a cocoa plantation. And so the question is, where are the cocoa trees? Alright, and so in this picture, the cocoa trees are these guys down here. They're sort of scattered everywhere. But you'll notice cocoa plantations are not a plantation, they're a forest ecosystem. And one of the reasons why chocolate didn't grow very well for the Spanish when they first planted it is because they planted it as a plantation. But in reality, cocoa grows best as a forest ecosystem with it can be grown in full sun, but often it's grown with banana. It's often grown with other sorts of trees that give a year-round harvest for the farmers who are growing there, whether it be mango, whether it be papaya, whether it be banana, whether it be all those other things. So this is an example of a working cacao plantation. This is not from, as I travel, I will replace all these pictures with pictures I've taken. Not all of them are pictures I've taken. This is one that I've taken, so it was not in Haiti, because I haven't been there yet, but it gives an example of what most plantations are like everywhere in the world. as a forest ecosystem like that. So what did people think of the honey sweet? The honey is very different, right? It makes a very different flavor profile to your chocolate.
I didn't like it at first, but the more I ate it, the more I liked it. So,
Yeah, and it's interesting with the honeymoon chocolate is we could do a sampling just of their chocolates and taste how the honey reacts with the different origins, because they have about 6 different single origin chocolates, all sweet with honey. It can be very different. It can often make the lighter chocolates taste darker, and it can often make the darker chocolates taste lighter. Because here we are at 77%, which in reality is getting pretty dark, right, as things go. You're up to 70%. Has anything been too strong, too intense yet? Nothing's been too intense yet. Good. Yeah.
You were talking about single origin. When you use the cooperative model in these places, is it still considered single origin?
There's no, when you get to terms that's used in chocolate, there's no defined legal definition of what you're talking about, right? So you can essentially say what you want, except that if you say you're chocolate, you cannot have any other fat in your bar other than cocoa butter or milk. If you have an oil, then you cannot legally call yourself chocolate anymore. You can be chocolate coating, you can be confectioner's coating, you can be some other thing, which means that legally a coconut milk chocolate is not legally chocolate because it has a fat in it other than dairy.
what's cocoa butter?
Cocoa butter is a cocoa bean that's been pressed. And so if you press an olive, you get olive oil. If you press a cocoa bean, you get cocoa butter.
Oh, so aside from making the chocolate part, okay.
And so it's called cocoa butter because it's solid at room temperature. And in fact, it's used in cosmetics because guess what temperature it melts at? 98 degrees.
I've heard of it in cosmetics, but I just realized.
So that's why it's often the most common carrier oil in cosmetics, in lipsticks and those sorts of things, because it melts. It's solid at room temperature, but as soon as it encounters warm skin, it melts, right? Because it melts at 98 degrees.
So does that go through like the fermentation process to get to that, or is that like
Yes.
raw? Okay.
Yep. And so when we get to the fermentation process, we'll talk about those different steps. So to call yourself chocolate, you can only have milk, fat, and or cocoa butter as your fats, right? The only other defined terms by the U.S. government will be white chocolate, semi-sweet chocolate, bittersweet chocolate, right, which have defined cocoa percentages, and milk chocolate and defined milk powder percentages, right? Those are all defined terms. But dark chocolate is not a defined term, right? So anyone can use the term dark chocolate as long as they meet the chocolate standard, what it is. But in reality, do people police the chocolate bars? No. Right? But you'll notice a lot of chocolate bars over there, and I don't know if they do it intentionally or not, will say 55% coconut milk. They don't actually call themselves chocolate anywhere on the bar. But you just know it's a chocolate bar because it looks like one, right? All right, so we did Haiti, and our next stop is going to be the Dominican Republic, and the Dominican Republic is in spot number 2. And that is the bar that we make here. So that's what this bar looks like. So we make that here. And Monte Plata is the region of the Dominican Republic. Monte Plata is an organic cacao farm. It's run by a company called Cacao. They have a warehouse in New York, which makes it really easy to get small quantities of product, okay, to make chocolate. This is a 70%, and we're going to go through a little bit now about what the chocolate tree actually looks like. So there is a chocolate tree with its flowers. You can see this at Brook. Brook has a chocolate tree. The flowers go right out of the trunk, and there's a term for it which is escaping me now. Maybe some botanist out there knows the term for a plant that flowers right out of its trunk. And there are your cocoa pods as they ripen. Some places have continuous cocoa harvesting. Some places have seasons. Often if there's dry or wet seasons, there'll be seasons to it.
What about the color difference in
The
that picture?
the color difference is age, whether it's ripe or not. And is this one ripe? It certainly looks ripe, but it might not be. It depends on the variety. That's what the inside of a cocoa pod looks like. So you can see it's surrounded by this white gelatinous sort of stuff. That's the sugar that's used in the fermentation process. And so in the field, those cocoa beans are cracked open, the insides are pulled out, and all this is left in the field. They're harvested or at the end of the row. And then this is brought back to the fermentation facility.
So that has the white
Pulp.
substrate and the bean.
The beans inside. So a dramatic example would be a pomegranate seed, right? With its flesh and juicy part outside and the hard little seed inside. Not quite so dramatic, but same idea. You have this white pulpy flesh on the outside, the seed on the inside. And so then that would be brought back to the fermentation facility. All right, so you can see one thing that I do on my bars, if you ever look at them, is I always think it's interesting. And the reason why I do this is you'll see on the back, I say that 70% cacao, 30% sugar, right? Two ingredients. Sometimes you'll see on a bar, cacao, sugar, and then cocoa butter, right, as a third ingredient. Because you could make a bar that's 60% cacao, 30% sugar, 10% cocoa butter, and it would still be considered a 70% bar. But your flavor profile will be different, your texture will be different. You may do that because you're hiding the quality of your chocolate. You may do that because you want a super, super soft mouthfeel, right? There are different ways to do it. It's not like it's a trade secret. Most people don't do it. I always want to know it when I look at a bar, so I put it on my bars what the different percentages are, so it's clear exactly what's in there. So if you look at one of my milk chocolates, it will say that it's 12% milk powder, 39% sugar, and 49% chocolate. And then 22% cocoa butter, I think. Milk chocolate often has cocoa butter added to it because milk makes the chocolate really thick. So you have to have cocoa butter as a lubricant. All right, so what did people think of the Monte Plata Dominican? I'll be honest, this was not a bar that I intended to make. I made it because people asked for it. Because I'm thinking, I'm making this dark chocolate bar when I have the best in the world sitting there. What do I think that I'm going to do making a dark chocolate bar? But it is dark chocolate that we use to coat all of our animals, all of our toffee, all the chunks in our cream scones, right? Is all chocolate that we make here. With organic cacao and organic sugar. The bar isn't organic because we're not in an organic facility. Yeah.
Must panic on one.
Well, so what I taste, and you can taste different things, is I taste a very fruity
Yeah.
acidity to it.
Yeah, it sort of dried my mouth at the very end of it.
And the reason why I chose Monte Plata was because it's higher in cocoa butter of the different origins. So beans are approximately 50-50. Monte Plata is about 53-47 cocoa butter to cocoa solids. So that more cocoa butter means I can make a milk chocolate, which was my real intent, and not have to add as much cocoa butter. And a milk chocolate, like I said, takes your flavor peak, goes like that to it, so it doesn't matter nearly as much which chocolate you choose when you're making a milk chocolate. So if I were to go back with the intent of making a dark chocolate, I may ask them again, can you please send me your sample of 20 different origins or fermentation profiles, and I'll choose the one I want to make my dark chocolate. But it works really well for the Door County Cherry Bar, so I figure why bother changing. So hopefully people, I mean, it's not bad, right? I think it's pretty good.
It's good.
But it's not the same as the other ones you're gonna try. So like I said, most of the cacao comes from, in the United States, comes from the Dominican Republic just because it's close. They have a very well-developed infrastructure there. So any comments, questions so far? No. As we go through the Caribbean?
Is there any use for the pod?
Mulch. They just leave it underneath the trees and it just goes back to the soil. It's really a weight thing. There's no reason why they want to carry that anywhere. So they may collect them in a basket, take it to the end of the row, take all the seeds out, and then leave the pods.
There's been stories about the amount of lead in dark chocolate. Where does that come from?
That comes from Consumer Reports deciding to report on it, is where it comes from, in essence. But it is something that's out there. It is something that we need to be aware of. But the fact is that most things that grow in the ground will absorb things from the ground that they grow in. So a lot of the chocolates that they tested were from Ghana and Ivory Coast, where there may be some concerns of higher levels of those things in the soil. Everything in moderation, and I don't think you have to worry.
Does it require refrigeration to come up on the ship? I assume it's shipped to a port.
Yeah, so the beans, when they're shipped, are considered a raw product, and they can spoil in extremely humid conditions. So, but they're not refrigerated. They just hopefully are not left on the dock for more important things like coffee, which sometimes happens.
So are they shipped before they're fermented?
No,
No.
they're shipped
fermented
after
there and then
after they're fermented.
Okay.
And we'll get there. All right, so we tried the Dominican Republic, right? And there's lots of different regions in the Dominican Republic that grow cacao. So now we're gonna go down here to Grenada, right? Grenada is number one. Woo! Now we can start going. All right. So some of you already tried this one. If you need another sample, now that we're on Grenada, does anyone need another sample to so they can remember what Grenada tried like? Because you already had it. And we'll go into this more. This is a bar that I brought back from my trip to Grenada. It's a bar that is not available in the United States, really, except here.
Except when you put it in your suitcase.
Except when you put it in your suitcase and bring it home. Sort of funny, the story about, because he doesn't want to deal with shipping and importing and all that sort of stuff. If I were to order more from him, from Kim is his name, the next traveler he encounters that's going to the United States, he'd give them the box and say, put this in the mail when you get to Miami.
Thank you.
Yep.
And this is Crayfish Bay?
This is Crayfish Bay. They have an Airbnb, so if you want to stay there, you can stay there and help him. That's what it looks like from the front porch of the Airbnb. We'll go more into his business and what he does in the Grenada talk. But suffice to say, my wife would say, don't show anyone a picture of how he makes his chocolate, so I won't. But what's interesting about him is he's, what?
Is it rustic?
No, he's just smoking and barefoot.
Oh.
But his chocolate room is air conditioned. It's probably the only air conditioned thing in the entire place, right? But no. So anyway, so he really works with the land. He bought his cacao plantation after Hurricane Andrew, whichever one was in like 2002, 2004, somewhere in there, from the British government. There was a cacao plantation for the British back 100 years ago, and he bought it from them and is returning it to Grenadians. Right? So that's what it looks like there. Again, this is an example of a new grove that he's planting on the property there. Right? You can notice the little cacao trees here, but you notice the bananas that are growing up. One of the interesting things he does is he charcoal roasts his chocolate. Maybe you taste that in the chocolate. His batches are very seasonal. I said, boy, you know what, that chocolate I tried that I got at the grocery store down in the main city there, I said, boy, it was so acidic that it was hard for me to handle. And he said, oh, you probably got the December batch. So, yeah. And so I don't know, what do people think of this bar?
I like it.
So I believe there are only about 4 left, right? Three left. So it says charcoal roasted beans. He buys his charcoal from people who live there. By law in Grenada, you cannot make charcoal except from fallen material. You can't cut material to make charcoal. So he buys his charcoal down at the market. He built his own charcoal roaster. It sits about 2 feet below his thing. Every time he walks by, he sort of gives it a twirl. And then he keeps on going. Next time he walks by, he gives it a twirl, right? And, you know, until it smells done, he says. So this is an example of a chocolate bar made by one person in his own setup, in his own facility, without a cooperative. Very, very small batch stuff, right? He does export to one company in England, Pump Street, which we're going to try Pump Street. We're not going to try their Crayfish Bay Grenada bar. But he does export to one. But he does have a lot of workers that work for him. It's not all him that does it. But one of the fun things he does is workers, if they harvest the cacao, they can plant whatever else they want on the property, and it's theirs.
Wow.
So if the workers planted those banana trees, they're now their banana trees as long as they harvest his cacao. So yeah, so that's so I'm tempted to give him a call or send him an email. Say, hey, I'm about out. I need some more. See how it goes. Right, I have to Western Union him the money, and so he can go down and pick it up, and then because I didn't bring enough cash on me when I went to his place, so he said, just send it to me when you get home. So I took all the chocolate and sent it to him when I got home. And then now that we're getting into the fermentation, here's an example of fermentation. I should have bumped the contrast or the brightness up on this picture. But this was at Belmont Estates, so this is one of their fermentation boxes, covered in banana leaves, because banana leaves have the bacteria in them, the right inoculant to give the flavor profile. That's the traditional covering to a fermentation box, is banana leaves all over the world. And I don't know what it is about banana leaves. There, I have a chocolate from Taiwan where the guy really experiments with different kinds of fermentation, inoculating his fermentation pile with different yeasts, completely changing the flavor of your bean. And so the fermentation process is really, really important, which is why craft chocolate makers are going back to the farmers and saying, hey, you have to really, really pay attention to your fermentation, which is why the cooperative sort of developed, so that they could control that fermentation with someone who knew what was going, because none of these places they eat chocolate bars. It's too high. They drink all their chocolate, right? So the vast majority of farmers have never eaten a chocolate bar who are growing cacao. So how would they know what they needed to do to get something to the market? Which brings us back to another point of these chocolate bars, is that the average price for a ton of cacao on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, I think, is $1,300 a ton right now. So an average family can make 2 to 3 tons in a year off their farm, wherever they are in the world. Most of these chocolate makers pay double. Right? So they're paying $26,000 to $3,000. Well, if you still can only make 2 to 3 tons a year, yes, it's more. It's still not very much. Right? So because cacao is all labor. Everything about it is labor. The biggest thing that happened in Grenada that he told me was that the average farmer of cacao was probably about 65. Because there's not money in it. So why would young people want to go become cacao farmers? So after they're fermented, and this is one stage that will be missing in your Hershey bar, is for speed, this takes about a week. Well, a week's a long time if you're producing 1 million tons of beans to make all your Hershey bars, right? All your M&Ms. So they strip the pulp off and throw them into industrial dryers, and then they're dry within a few hours, and then they can be packaged and sent off, right? So they skip the fermentation process altogether. But craft chocolate makers know how important that is in developing your flavor. So it's not like the beans coming from Ghana and Ivory Coast are bad beans, but if you treat a high quality product and pour away, you're probably going to get a poor outcome. That being said, chocolate beans from Ghana and Ivory Coast are lower quality overall, but it doesn't mean they have to make bad chocolate. And we do have some bars that do that. After they are fermented, then they go onto these drying trays, and they dry in the sun. And at night they're pushed under there, and in the day they they pull out until they're fully dry. And then after they're dry, this is in a bigger place. They go into a commercial sorting machine, and they're dumped in here, and all these different holes will let the different graded by size of bean. Right?
Like
And-
potatoes or apples.
And then they are hand sorted before they're put into a bag to get rid of rocks, to get rid of poor quality beans, things like that. Again, it's all about labor, right? It's a huge labor cost. All right, so we tried Grenada, and now we are gonna go on to, see where are we going next? Oh, Trinidad, that's right. So Trinidad is gonna be the next one down, right? Your top 5 should be empty now, so it should be number 6. It's this bar. This is what the northern coast of Trinidad looks like. This is by Sea Red Chocolate. This is made in Canada.
Canada?
Made in Canada from Trinidad beans. Back in 1920, Trinidad was the largest exporter of cacao in the world. Not anymore, right? But they were at one point because most of the cacao was grown in the Caribbean. So in the world Caribbean, in the world trade market, or in the world cacao market, there's often what's called bulk beans, fine flavor beans. Fine flavor beans would be considered a Trinitario, or in this case, a Criollo. So you can see these are all ripe pods of different cultivars of chocolate trees. These are all from Venezuela. These are all the most rare pods you can get. This is what the Aztecs valued more than anything else in their trade, right? Were these beans from Venezuela. These trees were planted up into El Salvador, planted in the Soconusco coast by Guatemala, in southern Mexico. Think of a country like Mexico. Cacao only came from a very small area in Mexico, the Soconusco coast, just north of Guatemala. So these is what you get. But what happened when they planted these trees everywhere, these Criollo trees, they died. They didn't grow. They needed very specific climate, very specific ways to grow. So they realized, well, there are these guys here that look like that. They grow in Brazil. They seem hardy. Let's try growing those. Right? This is called amanelado type. Right? You can sort of see melon-like. Right? They took these and planted them in Trinidad, and they grew. Right? They were more resilient. They could grow more places. But the people who lived in Trinidad said, these are not what we're used to growing. So we're going to call these forasteros, which means foreigners. We're going to call these criollos, which mean native. Right? And what you got then were trinitarios, named from the island of Trinidad, which was they freely hybridize to give you flavor from the criollo beans, but hardiness of the forastero beans. So all over the Caribbean, this is what you're getting. Right? And you can see what a huge variety of cacao there is. And so when I get back to bulk markets, of the total cacao that's grown in the United States, 5% of the world's cocoa supply is considered fine flavor chocolate. Right? 5% of the world's supply are those kinds of beans. 80% of those beans still come from the Caribbean. Right? So of the chocolate that you're sampling here, the vast majority are still coming from the Caribbean. Small amounts will come from other places. But because they're resilient, a lot of these criollo trees hung on in the places they were planted. So when the forasteros were planted, natural hybrids occurred. And then over the ensuing centuries, these were selected for by the people who lived there. Right? So it's named after Trinidad, the Trinitario. So like I said, in 1920, they were the largest exporter of cacao in the world. But remember, cacao was a very labor-intensive process. As slavery was no longer allowed, cacao production went way down because you no longer had free labor. When disease started to come through, then it wiped out a lot of these plantations because they were not growing as forest ecosystems. They were growing as plantations. And that's when Africa took over. Right, so Ghana and Ivory Coast now are the dominant growers of Forastero types. But they're not of this type, they're of the special type called CCN 51, which is a selected cultivar that is unbelievably abundant. And it's grown for its abundance. So that's what you get on the island of Trinidad. Today, Grenada produces more cacao than Trinidad. Just because of the infrastructure. Just because when I was in Grenada, I said, "Oh, I should go to Trinidad," and then Ian said, "You don't want to go to Trinidad." So, so what did people think of this one? So this is from a single plantation called Rio Claro.
It's very good.
Some of my favorite cacaos have come from Trinidad. Moruga was one, a plantation that was made by a company about 4 years ago. That was still my absolute favorite chocolate ever. But for whatever reason in Trinidad, the access to beans at plantations ebbs and flows. And what you can get 1 year, you can't get the next year. And I don't know the specific reason why. So it's a limited edition for a reason. Siran will make a limited edition of runs if they can get 500-ish pounds of beans. They'll make a run of chocolate bars, maybe 1,000 pounds of beans, which will make, 2,000 bars, something like that, 3,000 bars. So yeah, so it's just amazing, all these varieties of cacao, right? And everything that can be ripened. You think about the varieties of apples, right? Similar, right? When you really get down to it, those flavor profiles you can taste in the chocolates, maybe not quite as evident as apple flavor tastes, but still very distinct in their own way. And I thought it'd be fun to go to Venezuela. So the next one is your last chocolate on your list. And that is this one. This is a pure Criollo bean, right? This is really one, if you're going to just let something sit and melt, you should let this one sit and melt on your tongue. Jamori in the 90s is an Italian company. This is made in Italy. They went to Venezuela in the 90s and started doing a ecological study and history of cacao in Venezuela and collected all the most rare, all the most prized cacao varieties and planted them in a single plantation on the northern coast of Venezuela, Hacienda de San Jose. And all those varieties that we saw here, they grow all of these varieties as distinct criollos that they found in Venezuela. The only one I haven't tried is, I didn't know about Ocamare 67 or 61. But at one point, Camori has made bars of all the others. Very interesting, right? I don't know what you think of Guisare. If you notice its texture, if you know the flavor, this is 70%. Of all the bars, of all these criollos, to me, this tastes the most chocolatey. It's sometimes funny to think of a chocolate as tasting chocolatey. But when you start realizing all these different flavor profiles, something can taste chocolatey as opposed to fruity, or as opposed to earthy, or as opposed to dry, or as opposed to dark. We don't have access to these anymore. Chihuahua is very citrusy. Canoabo is almost a cherry-ish flavor to it. I actually don't remember what Ocamario is. Porcelana was indescribable. It was almost like a bread, it was like a weird thing. But the interesting thing about Porcelana is it exists all over Central America, and where it grows makes it taste completely different. So, sort of like when they took Honeycrisp apple from Minnesota and planted it out in Washington, it didn't taste like a Honeycrisp grown in Minnesota. Same thing with some of these beans, with some of these trees, where they're planted makes a huge difference. Not just the genetics of the tree itself, but what it's pulling from the soil. So that's this one. This right now is the only pure Criollo bar that I think I have, partially because most of them come from Venezuela, although some come from Ecuador and Peru as well. But they have a different name there because genetically they're a different strain. They're called Heirloom Nacional in those places, but it's actually a different strain than a Criollo. So I have some of those bars, but they're characteristic by a white seed. They have white cotyledons in the bean as opposed to purple. So lots of places in Central America, like if you go to the bars in El Salvador, take care, lots of cacao grows in El Salvador. They call their stuff criollo as well, because in Spanish, criollo means native. So it's always been there. So yes, it's criollo. And what they really are is called acriollado, which is criollo-like, because they have a mix of white and purple beans. And you can do genetic testing to figure out exactly what's there. And a lot of the challenges, both in Venezuela and in a lot of these countries, is trying to preserve the heritage that's there and not be convinced by big exporters to plant CCN 51, which they say, oh, you'll produce 3 times as many beans on the same amount of land, so you should rip these trees out and plant these ones, because that's all they need for the bulk markets anyway. Even though Peru has an incredible heritage of heirloom beans and fine flavor beans, there's still a huge, huge exporter of sort of the lower quality beans as well. And there's a constant struggle to keep farmers planting this sort of stuff as opposed to the stuff the big exporters want. So what do people think of this one?
Very good.
Very smooth?
Very smooth.
All right, well now this last one's easy, because we only got one left, right? So here we are at Jamaica. And this guy, Desmond, he has a very interesting story, which I don't know the full story of, but I'm hoping to read up on him more in the future now that I sort of know about him. I didn't really do the research until preparing for tonight. He worked for many years, especially to reclaim his grandfather's estate, which was Bachelor's Hall. So this comes from Bachelor's Hall in Jamaica. This is 75%. He manages this as a 300-acre property. Right? So he has a lot of people working for him. But he struggled with the same things that a lot of the other places did, is he would sell, even fine flavor beans could be sold into the bulk markets. It didn't matter, the bulk market doesn't care if you're a fine flavor bean or a bulk bean. Right? And after that same Hurricane Andrew, he had to rebuild, and the US actually gave a lot of money to different organizations to help improve the livelihood of people in Jamaica. And one of the things they did was they brought people in who knew how to get higher value for the cacao they were growing and showed them how to properly ferment for the craft chocolate markets. He went and learned and said, holy smokes, right? This is what I'm gonna do. And so now he does. And so now Bachelor's Hall Estate produces some of the most amazing chocolate. This is made by Plum Street in England. I'm out of the 90% bar, but their 90% bar is my absolute favorite 90% that I've ever had. You don't find high percentage single origin bars very often. Most of the time high percentages are blends, because you have no leeway to blend off flavors or blend other things, right? If you have what you have, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? Except in the fermentation process. So Bachelor's Hall Estate makes a 90%, which I'm currently out of. That's pretty amazing.
So this, to me, this one would like more of a crunch to it if you bite it. Is that the processing or is that the bean?
More of a snap. It could have to do with the amount of cocoa butter. So more cocoa butter makes it softer.
Okay.
The most important texture in chocolate is the initial mouthfeel of your chocolate for people deciding whether they like it or not. Which means that you want your chocolate to have a soft bite. Right? A harder chocolate often has a lower score in terms of how much people like it, because it's harder, right? It's more chalky, it's more brittle, because it's more sensitive to a colder mouth. But you go with a person like Emily de Rios in San Salvador, she intentionally leaves her chocolate harder, because with less cocoa butter, you're more resistant to melting. And when she's selling her bars to the people at the mall where she is in San Salvador, she doesn't want the bars to melt on them. So she leaves them harder on purpose. In terms of Plum Street, that's probably not their purpose, but it is a thicker bar, which could affect And if you have any left, or you can try some of Kirsten's and say, oh, sorry, they missed that one. You can, if you let it melt, it should be really smooth. But if you bite it, because of the thickness, it may not, the upper surfaces will be warm for your mouth, but the inner surface will still be cold. The inner part of the bar will still be cold.
Where is this one made?
It's made in England.
England?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't hold it up. Here's Home Street. They started making chocolate, their bakery. They started making chocolate because they didn't like the chocolate they were using in their baked goods. So in their basement, they became one of the best single origin chocolate makers in the world. They are the ones who actually first got me interested in chocolate in Grenada, because they're making crayfish bay chocolate. They actually, I have one up there with nutmeg. So they have a nutmeg crayfish bay, because you can get the nutmeg from Grenada as well. So that's the Plum Street. One interesting thing about most of these bars, not all of them, this bar is completely compostable. The Honeymoon bar is completely compostable. Crayfish Bay bar is not. Sirena at least is recyclable. But any of these wrappers, and including the plastic wrappers you have there, we take and compost for you if you ever bring them back. Everything else that we try and have just be recyclable is preferable to compostable if possible. So our bars are wrapped in paper, and the inner wrapper is just foil. So the foil can be recycled, and the paper can be recycled. If it's dirty, then it has to be composted or thrown out, which is where these wrappers come in, because they have no inner wrapper. It's just the bar is in, so you have chocolate that's touching the wrapper, so then it would be recyclable anyway. They just do that for speed of wrapping. But you'll see a lot of chocolate makers that are going to compostable packaging. All right, and I have one last slide for you here. And this is the first pictorial evidence of chocolate being made into a drink. So this was found in Guatemala. It says in Mexico, but I believe it was the Olmecs went up into, at that point, I think Guatemala was part of Mexico. And this is actually a vase that's been unfolded. So it's not a flat, it's written around the vase. One of the nice things about the Olmec pottery is they would put the recipes on the vessels that held the drinks. So once you learned how to read them, you could sort of tell what was in there. So you can see 1400 BCE is the first evidence, pictorial evidence of cacao being used as a drink. The first evidence of cacao being cultivated is from Ecuador, from about 4,000 years ago. But they think down in Ecuador it was not made into chocolate or made into a drink, it was just eaten as the pulp side, right, that pulpy stuff. And I think that's what was done.
What nutritional value does the pulp have?
It tastes sweet. The reason why it was made into a drink, I mean, again, people are hypothesizing why it was made into a drink, is that the active ingredient in chocolate is theobromine. Theobromine is one carbon group different from caffeine, right? That single carbon group makes it not addictive, has the same psychoactive properties, and kills dogs, right? That one carbon group. In Mesoamerica, there were no plants that had psychoactive properties, but you could get that by making a chocolate drink and extracting it out of the cocoa bean. In South America, there were oodles of plants that could give you psychoactive effects. So there was no need, essentially no push to do that. That's one hypothesis of how that developed. But, yeah. So any other questions? So all the bars that you tried tonight are all up there if you're interested in any of those. Of course, there's everything in the shop. We'll be here for another half hour or more to answer any questions you have. Any questions?
You talked about pairing some of the chocolates, like with wine or coffee or...
Yeah, so in general, warm things are better to pair with than cold things. If you're going to do something cold, you generally want it softer chocolate. So for example, something high in cocoa butter will be softer. Something more in sugar will be softer. So if you're going to have a chilled white wine, you probably want a white chocolate or a soft milk chocolate, right? Because you want it to be able to melt even with a colder mouth, right? You want it to be sweeter because your wine is sweeter. If you pair it with a darker red wine, then you probably go with a darker chocolate, something that will have a palate, something that will sit on your palate for longer periods of time, so you can mix it and match it that way. We have suggestions over there of white wine and dark and red wine pairing packs, but in reality, if you choose a chocolate that you like, if you choose a wine that you like, you're not going to go wrong. Right? It's really easy to get 90% of the way there. It takes a lot of trial and error because there's so many wines, right? Even within, Merlot, right? There's going to be so many different kinds of Merlot, right? It's really hard to make generalizations of what chocolates pair, except choose something you like.
I prefer coffee with chocolate myself.
So coffee is a particular one where you want to choose a stronger chocolate because you need something that can hold the flavor to compete almost with the coffee. And so the Pralu bar, the Cuba bar was one that we would suggest that would do that. Also some of the darker ones that we have down on the end of our dark chocolate shelf would also be ones that we suggest. And what's really most interesting about that and pairing it with coffee is spacing out in time your pairing. So if you have your coffee and you let that sort of fade and then try your chocolate, your mouth is still warm and it will melt your chocolate. Or you can put your chocolate in your mouth, drink your hot drink, let the drink melt the chocolate, which totally changes its flavor profile. Which is why I think tea is the only way to go. Because tea will not necessarily mask your flavor profile. Now, a chai tea is not necessarily the way I would go, but going with a light green tea or a light black tea, putting the chocolate in your mouth and tasting some of that tea really, really changes the flavor profile. So for a long time, Bobby, you probably moved it. Where's the Michael Clisel bar?
What are we looking
The Michael Clisel 99. Yep, we did this down there for a while. So for a while, my favorite bar was the Noir and Fini Michael Clisel bar. Black one.
We have?
Aha! See, I knew you could find it. This has been one of my favorite bars for a really long time. This is a Michael Clisel bar from France, Noir and Fini, 99%. This came out when this was unheard of, right? Yeah. Since this has come out, there are lots of 100% that are sort of more or better necessarily than this bar. But this bar paired with something warm, if this appeals to you, right, is as close to eating a little bit of the earth as you can get to while it's still being palatable, right? Which is a very interesting experience, right? And so this was always my favorite part. So this is where when people come in and ask me what's my favorite chocolate, I have to qualify my answer. Because for a while I'd say, well, this is my favorite chocolate because I'd always pair it with tea. And then people would buy it, and I'm sure they didn't like it. So I have to qualify. So asking which is my favorite chocolate is just sort of an unanswerable question. Yeah. So
I was really surprised at the difference in all of these. I mean, even looking at them, there's a little bit of a color difference, but the flavor difference is really remarkable.
Yeah, and we didn't vary too much in terms of percentage here. We varied pretty much between 70 and 75, 77%. There wasn't too much variation. Sometimes in the tasting,
They think you're part of the art thing.
I'm sure they do.
That's what the other women thought.
To try an 80, to try an 85, to try a 90. Like the Amade from Italy, the 90, the Amade Toscano Black is going to be, if you think of a light ethereal chocolate, like that's just light, like it's the lightest 90% you'll ever try. It's a blend. To achieve that, it's a blend. It's very unlike the Jamaican 90%, which is not light at all, but it has lots of ups and downs and flavors. Whereas the Amade 90 is processed in a way to keep it very light, right as 90% go.
Can you talk quickly about cacao nibs? What part of either the process or the pod or the beans?
Yeah, so after the fermentation and drying process, those beans would be packed into bags as a raw agricultural product to be shipped to wherever they're making the chocolate. Those chocolate makers would get those beans, put them in a roaster, roast them however they chose to roast them. Hot and fast, slow and cool, there's an infinite number of ways you can roast them. And then they're crushed and then put into a winnowing machine. And that winnowing machine is just a vacuum with a pipe, right? And the crushed chocolate bean goes into the pipe. The light husks go up, the hard nibs go down. And so the nib is the roasted chocolate that has been essentially just crushed. But it's still very, very chunky. Don't we have a thing of nibs here somewhere?
Yes. Yeah.
Right, so these are what nibs would look like. And you can use nibs in anything that calls for nuts. So I had someone who wanted, our praline bars have pecans in them. They wanted a nut-free version. We'd replace the pecans with nibs. And they smell very chocolatey. Eating them one at a time or in your granola or in something like that, they can be very fun and taste very chocolatey. You don't want to eat a whole handful of them because then often it tastes like eating twigs. I've tried. Yeah, so that's what a nib is. A nib is just and technically it doesn't have to be roasted either, it just has to be crushed and then winnowed away from the husk. Gives you a nib because often the fermentation process is hot enough that it starts to crack apart the inner cotyledons of the bean that if it were crushed would break into nibs anyway. Because one of the brands we have here, Yaraha, doesn't roast their beans, they leave them unroasted. And so they skip that step.
And cocoa powder is?
Cocoa powder is if you put this under, I'm forgetting now, something like 20,000 tons of hydraulic pressure. You will press out the fat from the bean, and what will be left over is a mass of chocolate with that pressure generates heat. That heat melts the cocoa butter, which then would drip through a fine screen, and then that gets collected, that's your cocoa butter. Then anything that's left over is all the cocoa butter has been removed from, and then that gets ground into cocoa butter. So cocoa powder does have a tiny, tiny bit of cocoa butter in it, but virtually none.
How do they make the drink from the beans?
When you make a drink, you need to have much less refined chocolate. So it's done by hand. So if you've ever seen the metate mano for grinding corn, same thing for grinding beans. You just, the heat, they liquefy, and then they're frothed. One of the interesting things about this is the foam is always very important, and the foam you could get when they've done some chemical studies of the vessels that they find these pictures on. They find soap type molecules, and they think that people were doctoring their drink a little bit to make it a little bubblier. But the cocoa butter mixed with water will give you the frothing effect, and you can see that from a traditional molinillo that you spin between your hands. You see them in Mexico, and it makes a froth. Or you could do an immersion blender, or you could do a French press, right? And you get a foam on your chocolate drink. It actually produces a foam. In the Aztec or Olmec times, it was made of foam by pouring from high heights down in the turbulence of it landing in the next one, and so they pour it back and forth like that to slowly generate the foam. So yeah, any other chocolate questions? Like I said, the next talk I'll do will be on the chocolate of Grenada. There'll be no bars that we try that you can purchase for that one, because none of them are available in the United States, but assuming that if we have any of the crayfish bales left. So I don't think I'll get any new ones. But that will talk into more sort of my first trip, and we'll see how it's actually done on site, like what the different places look like, what's the contrast, what's the politics that go behind all of this stuff, because there's a lot of politics that are involved in these different countries, whether the government controls the export of the product, where in Grenada, you'll notice everything that's exported out of Grenada is organic, because if it's not organic, then it's controlled by the government, and Grenada Chocolate Factory successfully argued that their organic chocolate was not covered under the 1964 law that controlled all cacao grown in Grenada going through a governmental organization, because that just accounted for regular chocolate, and organic was a different product. Therefore, all the chocolate coming out of Grenada is organic, because now it doesn't have to fall under the governmental control. Okay, so there's lots of, and all these little countries all have various political things that go along with it, in terms of making the chocolate and getting it out of the countries. But to summarize, in the Caribbean, you have you had chocolate. I guess I never talked about it. I realized one thing I missed is, how did the cacao get to the Caribbean in the first place? So during the Aztec and Olmec times, there was no chocolate in the Caribbean, right? It was all grown down in this area, right? There weren't anything in those islands. That was all planted by the Spaniards or the Dutch. That's how all the chocolate got into the Caribbean. And it really had its heyday from the 1700s through 1920 was sort of the peak, until everything sort of came crashing down, and then everything transferred over to Africa. But because cacao can live in these areas, anything that was abandoned was naturalized into the forest. So as these plantations are rediscovered, like they did at Crayfish Bay, it's sort of been abandoned since the 20s. There was still cacao trees growing there, so all you had to do is clear away the cacao trees, start grafting, or start doing some different plantings and selecting for the different trees, and you have a viable cacao plantation again, because the genetic heritage is still there in all these places. What was there for many years, it didn't die out, it just naturalized into the forest.
How long before a cacao tree produces a pod?
A modern cacao tree will produce a pod, will produce a harvestable quantity of cacao in about 5 to 7 years.
It's like a cherry tree.
They're useful if you think about a commercial lifespan is probably about 30 years if you're really thinking commercially, before you'd start replacing them. This is coming more into focus in Hawaii, because one of the companies that we have, Manoa, is in Hawaii. They make the chocolate in Hawaii. Their cacao runs about $10,000 to $12,000 a ton. So 10 times the normal rate in Hawaii. And they kept having farmers saying, oh, we're going to sell you our chocolate. No, now we're not. We're just making our own. So they've been working on planting their own plantation. And so it's been fun to follow their plantation. They should get their first harvest this year, in which they'll make a harvest from a brand new plantation there in Hawaii that they planted intentionally for their bars.
Why were their beans so much more expensive? Were they like,
Labor.
oh,
Everything is about labor.
I thought it was deliciousness. I was like, is that like the truffles of the chocolate world?
No, it's just all about labor. Just that everything's more expensive in Hawaii, right?
Are they planting that like a traditional plantation, or are they using the?
It's interesting they're not. They're planting them in full sun, which I found very interesting in Hawaii there, and they're not intercropping as far as I can tell. Maybe that's still coming. So we'll see. I mean, they should know what they're doing. But it's not being planted in a traditional way there in Hawaii, which I was very surprised to see. But I don't know specifically why. But if you ever go to Manoa and want to learn about more, I don't recall the guy's name who runs it. He has his own chocolate TV, and you can watch hours and hours of what he does. He's very transparent about everything he does. Back from when he started off running his winnowing machine as a college student, riding a bicycle to generate the power to the winnowing machine.
Does they have banana trees to grow for the fermentation?
Yeah, and I don't know if they use banana leaves for fermentation there. That's just the traditional leaf that's used to cover the beans, the banana leaf. But obviously other things can be used. And some people do experiments with intentionally inoculating the pile with different kinds of yeast, brewer's yeast, wine yeast, different sorts of things, just to see what would happen. And it makes completely different flavor profiles.
And to label organic means what? When you see organic exactly? No
It means they
chemical?
paid to be certified organic.
They pay, okay.
Any label costs money. The vast majority of these will not be called organic, but almost all cacao plantations are low input, low output. They don't do anything, they take what it gives. Not exclusively, but the vast majority of these places will not be organic because they've never bothered to pay or keep the receipts or do all the loopholes that you have to do to become organic, unless there's a specific reason to do so. Like in terms of Grenada, if it's certified organic, then they can circumvent the governmental rules. If it's a bigger company like that comes out of the Dominican Republic, that's a useful thing to have on chocolate you're marketing to the United States, is that it's organic. So they've paid and gone through the organic certification for like the beans that we use. One thing we dig into, we don't use beans, we use pre-ground, already roasted mass to make our chocolate here. So we don't have to have all that equipment. Because, like I said before, I could ask them for samples of 20 different flavor profiles, and they would send me different roast and different fermentation flavor profiles, and I could choose whatever I wanted for whatever I'm going for.
Has the growing been impacted at all by the warming, like global warming? My daughter just told me all this stuff about coffee, but she doesn't drink coffee, and how it's impacting their plants with the global warming. I was curious because this is such a tight, like, growing area. Are
Right.
they impacted at all?
I think it's not as much about temperature as rainfall. So if rainfall patterns change, that will have a much bigger impact than if hot or cold patterns change. But for the most part, there's more cacao produced than is needed. Generally, there's a surplus of cacao in the market. So, in terms of fine flavor cacao, there's always a buyer. Right? So there's generally not a surplus of that. But if you look at the global scale, there's a surplus. So, any other questions? We're good to go until I see you next time. The Grenada chocolate tasting is live online. If you want to sign up for that, you can sign up for here. You can. The whole shop is open for anything you want. Like I said, we'll stay around for until the last person leaves, within reason. Until my next cup of tea is gone. Yeah, we'll come and grab your cups. That's no problem. And you're welcome to take home the map with you that is yours so you can remember what you tried. Because the number one thing that helps me if you come back into the shop is what you tried and what you thought of it. Because then that can help me determine if you liked it or if you didn't like it or you want something similar, as opposed to having to guess what color the wrapper was or what shape the bar was or what font they used, right? Because I won't remember.